Russia's war on Ukraine is now about money and control, not just about lines on a map. The key question is whether the Kremlin can still buy obedience at home while fighting a major war abroad. And by now, this month, we see there are three clear signs that show strain on that system. In the air, Ukrainian drones are hitting Russian refineries. Time and again, we see that they are not prepared for what Ukraine is bringing. But more than that, Ukraine is striking targets deep inside of Crimea. That is something that's taking more and more of Russia's resources to protect. But inside the state itself, there's something else going on. And those are the leaked phone calls coming out. These leaked phone calls show that there are people within the Kremlin working against the president's wishes. But there's something else that has also come out at the same time, and that's the data coming out about Russia's own oil revenue. Today, we see that it has sharply fallen. But more than that, households sharply increased their foreign currency purchases. This is a sign that's not very good for Moscow. Taken together, these are not isolated incidences. Rather, they are pressure points on the same revenue chain that pays for the war, the regional subsidies, and the internal security. Ukraine is pushing on that chain from the outside with strikes on refineries, the power nodes, the rail links, and the tankers tied to Russia's shadow fleet. Moscow is pushing on it from the inside with asset seizures, heavier domestic borrowing, and tighter pressure on regions and elites close to the gap. The front line today in Donbass and along Dnipro still matter, but an equally important part of this war that we see right now is what is happening now with the export terminals, what is happening with the energy infrastructure, what is happening with the Russian central bank's balance sheet. The outcome depends on one issue. Can today a nuclear-armed petrostate keep financing war? Can it actually protect Crimea and repression when the oil cash that underpins all of the system begins weakening at the very same time? The answer today is quite obviously no, and that is why this can create a crisis that can rapidly destabilize the Putin regime. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. So let's get into this. Let's look at what's going on inside of Russia and why all these different things are connected. Because once you understand this, you'll see why this war is even worse from Russia than you might think. Obviously, they were not able to take Kupiansk as they'd bragged. We saw President Zelensky recently visited there. Ukraine is honest about what's going on. It talks about when it loses a village in the middle of Donbass that's been totally destroyed by this war. But the Russians, that is their greatest success so far. Can you imagine Russia, great Russia, the world's second greatest military, its greatest success in recent times was to claim they had taken an abandoned village somewhere in eastern Ukraine that nobody knew existed just a couple years ago. That's what Russia has to show for this war. But there's something else that they traded for that great success, which was obviously false. Kupiansk is not under Russian occupation. What they traded for that was their internal security. Today, we see more and more coming out of Moscow that makes it very clear that Russia, those in the senior leadership, don't trust each other. They realize there's something going wrong. Now, one of the most easy examples to cite are the leaked phone calls. That includes the phone calls with people like Dimitrov and with Ushakov. Ushakov is a senior foreign policy advisor to Vladimir Putin. And Dimitrov, of course, Kirill Dimitrov, is one of the top negotiators for the Russians right now in the current negotiations about Ukraine. And there's something really interesting, though, about the calls getting leaked right now. So obviously, it would appear that it's the intelligence service, the FSB, obviously the most powerful force today in Russia. But what would be their motivation? Why would they want to release these calls right now? Well, it's probably because they want to break up the peace process. But that's actually two different, very interesting things. Why would they want to do that? And what does this have to do with the collapse of Russia? Very simply, it is this. The FSB is trying its best to derail the current talks. It knows that these sorts of talks, should they end the war, would dry up a lot of revenue that they're currently making in the gray markets. This would take away a ton of money, a ton of opportunities that they currently have. Why would they want that? How is that possibly in their interest? They like to be in charge of everything in Russia, and today they have all the power. But if the war were to end, things could change. But today, they have the full justification to suppress the population inside of Russia, to take total control, and to seize assets however they wish. For the FSB and other security bodies, the leaks that we saw are definitely sort of a leverage. The more they hold compromising material, the more they can shape appointments, the budgets, and the outcomes inside of the state. Now, Ukraine does not need to guess motives in order to exploit these sorts of differences. It only needs the visible result, a slower and a more cautious state with longer decision cycles. It seems very likely that those who released these calls knew very well what they're doing. They understood that this would be very bad, embarrassing, in fact, for the Kremlin. But that's exactly why they do it. They wish to make a mockery of these talks. So that's very important because it relates to us something else. It relates to what level the fighting the Kremlin has reached. Now, keep in mind, before this, the Kremlin always tried to put on a united front. It always tried to show that everything is fine. We're a united team. We're all working together. But that's obviously not the case. That's why one part of the Kremlin at the senior leadership is trying to discredit the other one internationally. That is really incredible, and it is very not common for Russia. This is a first, but it shows you how tense things really are inside of the Kremlin. When you see these sorts of leaks, and that is that today, people become very nervous. Nobody knows whose phone's being listened to. And of course, Ukraine doesn't have to guess what the motive is behind these leaks to be able to exploit it. And that's what they were doing today. Ukraine understands that this right now means there is serious tension within the Kremlin. And Ukraine, at the same time, is doing its best to degrade Russia's cash conversion chain. And not just by burning the single targets, but going after Russia's entire sequence. Now, today, when they're going after these different things, as we know, they've been attacking things such as the Slavneft Yanos refinery near Yaroslavl. That's the one that has about 15 million metric tons of capacity a year. That's 300,000 barrels per day. What's incredible about this, these sorts of attacks that Ukraine's carrying out one after another, is that Russia is so totally unprepared. So Russia's always said that they could protect all their airspace. Now, anyone who's at least somewhat rational would probably realize that's impossible. Russia is a very, very big country. How could you really protect all your airspace? Well, they can't. But we'd be happy to know if you happen to work around those refineries that's not protected and will definitely explode when it's struck by a rocket. There is a lot of air defense around Vladimir Putin's house. There's a lot of air defense around his lover's house. But for the people that live somewhere near a refinery, there's probably not enough for them. And that's why today there's more and more talk of what's going on inside of Crimea. Ukraine has been carrying out attacks one after another in places like Saki, Fedosia, Simferopol, Genkoy. These places in Russian-occupied Crimea are very important because these attacks are on things like the oil facilities there, but also on the power infrastructure. Now, there's also been reports that came out that there have been attacks by the Ukrainians using missiles on the fuel depots and the refineries that are in charge for Crimean distribution. But by attacking these facilities, specifically in Crimea, there's more to the story than simply attacking Russia's economy. But that's why today it's going to be harder and harder for the Russians to keep it all together. What do you do today when the Ukrainians are both striking at your borders in places like Kursk, in Belgorod, but simultaneously they're repelling you in Kupiansk? At the same time, they're striking you, and striking you hard, in Crimea, but all at the same time across all of Russia. How will you possibly prepare yourself? What is the strategy you should have? Remember, Russia has a massive territory. How do you physically protect that massive territory? Well, today, they do not have any options. Today, the Russians have no ability to stop this, and it will only get worse. But one of the reasons it will undoubtedly get even worse, even faster than many predict, is because the economy is so bad today within Russia. We see that increasingly people are accumulating debt, and that debt is rising very quickly. The amount of people week after week, month after month, who are declaring bankruptcy or simply not repaying their loans is simply skyrocketing inside of Russia. Now, we consider the fact that the head of Sberbank, German Gref, who is the former Minister of Economics, has said that the ruble should be devalued, perhaps 25 or even 45% by the end of the year. That's pretty incredible. Now, keep in mind, the average Russian is spending more than 85% of their income just on food and on rent and on utilities. So after that, imagine losing almost half your income just in a month. How will you keep it together? How will you be able to pay your most basic expenses? The simple answer is you won't be able to. And that means there will be less people paying taxes. And if less people are paying taxes, that means the government has less money. And all these things directly fit together. Ukraine's strategy is so brilliant. It's been so interesting to watch how they have developed this and used it so wisely. Russia wants a war of attrition. A war of attrition is something that Russia historically has fought. because Russia is simply bigger. Russia is a country that can afford to throw thousands of soldiers at something and expect that eventually, in hand-to-hand combat, it will overwhelm its enemies and be able then to progress. But if you can't do that, if you're fighting a modern war that uses drones, or you never get up close with your enemy, but are destroyed kilometers from the battlefield, well, what can you do? How can you beat an army that doesn't allow you to even engage with them? So today, Ukraine has a major advantage. And that's why, once again, I will say, please see the first pinned comment below, where the question today is of how you too can contribute for the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones, as well as other equipment this Christmas season. Really, please help them. They need it. Thank you. So anyways, I continue. So what we see next, though, of going on with these drones, what's going on with the attacks Ukraine is carrying out, is that they are the most effective ones they probably have ever had in modern warfare. Ukraine's losses are substantially less than Russia's launches, and Russia has absolutely no solution. Many people question why it is they send these men off to these seemingly hopeless fights where they just go one after another and they get obliterated. What is really going to happen there? The truth of the matter is, the Russians themselves don't even know. They've never encountered a situation like this before. Despite their superior size, they do not have a superior military. Despite having a massive country, they're being beat by a smaller country. Russia today is not in a position to win this war. So despite the fact that Russia says everything's fine, that Russia is doing just great, that Russia's economy is bouncing back marvelously after the sanctions, nothing can be further from the truth. Today we see time and again that for the Russians, the situation has become not just challenging, but impossible. So today we should not really wonder what happens next with Russia. We should just always understand what's going to happen next to Russia. If they continue on this path, the Putin regime will come to an end even sooner than you might believe. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. And please do leave your comments below. I love reading them. And please do see that first pinned comment of how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers to get life-saving drones and other equipment. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.